The small village of Scole in Norfolk hosted a scientific investigation into the afterlife with astonishing results. The miraculous phenomena was recorded in the 1990s in the cellar of a farmhouse under strict scientific conditions. The experiments which took place are still considered to be some of the best evidence for an afterlife ever recorded. The Scole Group comprised of two married couples, Alan and Diana Bennett and Robin and Sandra Foy. Both couples shared the objective of proving beyond reasonable doubt that human consciousness survives beyond death. In 1993, they embarked on a 5-year experiment using revolutionary energy to produce tangible objects from the spirit world. The Scole Experiment became famous, with national newspapers covering the story, and there is now talk of a Hollywood film.
What happened here during the Scole Experiment was very successful and a dramatic effort which proved conclusively to us that life goes on after we all die.
Their spirit communicators requested that they place this empty glass dome on their table.
The glass dome was very important to the Scole work. Creative energy stored in the dome and was used by the spirit team to produce the phenomena that happened at Scole.
But the lights were the most remarkable thing.
There were various shapes, generally like a pea-sized light, and it had substance. They would come and sit on your hand, you could feel them.
They were intelligently directed and intelligently moving and would be responsive to our wishes, whether expressed or silent.
Very nice of you to have us here.
We knew that we were communicating with deceased personalities because a number of people who communicated with us were able to be identified by independent witnesses at the time who could testify as to them being people they knew, evidence which couldn't possibly have been known by anybody else.
Emily, when did you live on the earth?
Oh, a long time ago now.
19th century?
Yes.
We had anything up to 8 spirit people in the room with us at any one time.
Robin was the founder of the group, and he was joined by his wife Sandra, and the Bennetts were the physical trance mediums.
Physical mediumship itself is a pretty rare thing. There are very, very few genuine, good physical mediums around the world today. But certainly back in 1990, when we started to sort of think about a serious group, and we'd moved to Scole by that time, it was at that point that we considered really sort of getting into it in a proper way. And we didn't really expect Scole, when it happened, to happen as it did, or as well or as fast as it did. But it was quite amazing, and it took us all by surprise, but we went along with it, and we loved every minute of it. It involved 5,000 hours. That was over a period of 5 years. So about 1,000 hours a year of actually sitting there and getting fantastic phenomena. But we built a wonderful relationship with our spirit team, and it was absolutely just as though they were our partners, sort of on this side. We got to know them so well, and they made a point of getting our confidence by giving us information that none of us could possibly have known, but which turned out to be totally accurate once we checked it out afterwards. And of course, it got to the stage that we trusted them totally. Manu was the one guide that spoke at every single session. Manu was the main guide, I think, actually, of one of the two mediums. We had two mediums in the group. One of them was Diana, and the other one was Alan Bennett. They were a married couple.
Diana and Alan Bennett both joined the Scole Experimental Group in 1993. They both began seeing spirit at an early age.
My first discovery of being a medium was when I was a child. I used to see spirit. I used to hear things and be aware of things that other people weren't aware.
When I was young, I saw spirits that would come and show themselves to me.
and they both developed very, very quickly as physical mediums. And through them, we were getting instructions from the members of our spirit team to build certain apparatus for them, to help them in certain ways so they could develop the phenomena that we all wanted.
The communications were coming through almost exclusively through one or other of the two mediums, husband and wife, both of them, as far as we knew, in total trance, and they were unconscious of what was happening. At a later stage, we did have some direct voice, that's to say, voices which appeared to be coming from right in front of us and which were not using the larynxes of the two mediums. However, this is something which was certainly our very strong impression, but we couldn't prove it one way or the other, so we tended to rather disregard these distinctions. When the voices came through the mediums, which they normally did, the voices were quite different from those of the mediums themselves, and the personalities behind the voices were not only quite different, but were very consistent, even the accents were. And we began to recognize, it was very easy to recognize the female one because there was only one, and she was very, very idiosyncratic.
We continue from our side of life to influence people still in the body.
The most wonderful communicator of the lot, who was a lady called Emily Bradshaw. She was a real Victorian lady, and I think she came from very much from the upper classes. But Emily was the most fantastic woman for bringing evidence of survival to each and every one of us. And she spoke through Diana on a regular basis.
Emily, when did you live on the earth?
Oh, a long time ago now.
19th century?
Yes. It's the love that connects people.
Right.
And the rest doesn't matter a jot.
The first results that we properly got were in May 1993. The first phenomena we got was that the trumpet fell over one week while we were sitting off the table, and then the next week it actually gently removed itself from the table, levitated, and then went very, very gradually down to the floor. So that was the first, and then really we didn't get any more phenomena at all, although we were sitting week in, week out and trying to develop it, until the October of that year. And on that occasion, we actually had an apport of a coin which was called a Churchill crown. And that Churchill crown arrived during the sitting. We heard it drop onto the table quite loudly.
An apport is the mysterious appearance of an object from an unknown source, often associated with seances.
From that moment onwards, everything started to really take off. And within a few weeks, we had amazing things happening. There were more apports.
These newspapers arrived in pristine condition, despite having originated in the 1940s. But who might have sent it to the Scole Group, and why?
The newspapers that were apported, I think we had two actually different newspapers. The first one that we had apported had a story about Winston Churchill in it, and was going back to 1945. The second one that was apported was a newspaper from 1944, and it had a story in there about the materialisation medium Helen Duncan, and how unfortunately she had been taken to court and had been convicted of being a witch and sent to prison, and that was done by the government. And the reason that that was done was purely and simply because she was a genuine materialisation medium. People used to, spirit people materialise through her, and on one occasion she was having a séance in Portsmouth during the Second World War, and during the war there, a sailor materialised from a boat called the HMS Barham, which was a warship. And his mother, he materialised to his mother, who was there, and told her he had been in this boat, the HMS Barham, and that had been sunk. But the government had never let anybody know in wartime that that boat, the HMS Barham, and that had been sunk. They were very worried because it was not too long before D-Day in 1944, and they were very worried that somebody was going to come through, going to materialise through Helen Duncan, and actually give away secrets. They actually trumped up a charge. They sent her to prison for 6 months.
Dead British medium Helen Duncan spoke to them via one of the mediums. During World War II, Duncan's life was ruined when she was arrested and imprisoned for practicing mediumship. As she described her ordeal to the group, this newspaper allegedly appeared out of nowhere. To their astonishment, displayed prominently on its front page was the story of Duncan's trial and conviction.
I think she suffered greatly through her mediumship, and she was really coming to wish us well, and she bought the newspaper as a sign of a very turbulent time in her life.
Wartime newspapers would turn yellow within days when exposed to the natural environment, but both newspaper reports at Scole were in pristine condition.
The scientists knew that an old newspaper could easily be copied and printed onto modern paper, so Montague Keen had the suspect newspaper analysed.
We took it to the leading research station in England, indeed in the world, on paper and printing, and it was absolutely clear from their report that, first of all, it was done on letterpress, which has gone out of existence virtually since the early 1970s, I would say. It was newsprint produced during wartime, which lacked certain chemicals which you couldn't get hold of. So this was a genuine article which appeared 50 years after the event, but no one has been able to explain how it got there.
Following the materialization of a number of different reports, activity really began to accelerate in the Scole sessions.
And within a few weeks, we had amazing things happening. The actual trance speech they were producing, the two mediums, was changing so that it started to move away from them and the voices were coming out of the walls and everything. There was a particular communicator called Reg Lawrence, who was an engineer in his lifetime and who became very expert at producing voices from midair.
Oh, hello, Reg.
Hello, Brian. Very nice of you to have us here.
He just touched my hand.
Oh,
Oh, yes. Oh, he's stroking it. It's slightly cold, but it's flesh. He's shaking my hand. Oh, my God. Oh, Reg, you've made my year.
You've made mine.
As usual, Lawrence did not communicate through the mediums. Instead, the group could hear his voice projected from different parts of the room.
From that moment onwards, everything started to really take off. And then with the group we had some work done with photography. The first photographic results we got were with ordinary 35mm film mounted into two SLR 35mm cameras. We were told to bring them down to the room when we sat, and on the first occasion that we started to get proper stuff there, we actually put one camera on a vacant chair, and Sandra, my wife, held another camera, and the spirit team told us that whenever they said now, Sandra was to point the camera in the middle of the room in the darkness and just take a photograph, which she did, and they ran through the whole film that way. And then a little bit later on in the sitting, the second camera, which had been placed on a chair, had actually levitated and started taking pictures by itself. And when we had those films developed afterwards, we couldn't at first believe they were our own films, because they had all sorts of different images on them. There were 11 images on each of the films, and all sorts of different subjects. There were pictures of different people. We got a few results like that, and then we started to work with Polaroid films, which to begin with, and we did that because we actually went along to Polaroid and spoke to them, and they were good enough to say yes, they would try and back us with our investigations. So they gave us a lot of 35mm Polaroid films, which we never put in the camera at all, but purely, first of all, we left them still rolled up on the table during a sitting, and we got some very good results, different frames on the films doing that. And then finally, we were told, no, now we can get results. we want you to actually leave them in the shop-bought plastic carton. So, in fact, they never came out of that at all. They went into the room where we were sitting and were placed on the table in the sealed carton. They'd come from the shopping. And we started to get the most amazing stuff on there, all sorts of pictures of different places in the spirit world, pictures of stars, pictures of areas in the spirit world they described as areas of communication, where there appeared to be clouds on the picture, but the clouds turned into faces, and it was quite an amazing situation with all those photographs we got. And then when the three investigators, we had Montague Keane, Professor David Fontana, and Professor Arthur Ellison, came from the SPR and started to sit with us on a regular basis. They complicated it a bit further by asking us to put these films in the sealed containers into a security box to make even sure even further that nobody had touched them during that time.
I believe you were involved in the experiment where you actually held the box that the film was in during the session. Could you take us through that very briefly, please?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I investigated the box very thoroughly when I saw it the first time, and it was done in a very proper way, and I looked for possibilities what could be done at all if somebody would try to take something out or not. And even being included in this at the beginning, I came also up with some more proposals to make it absolutely safe, adding paint in certain areas that would show there's nothing that could have been tricked. So having this investigated, that was one part of the job. The second was that I was invited to use a film, a photographic film, and I got also the job to buy this film. So I bought it myself, had it all the time in my possession. It has never been outside my possession. I brought it to the sitting and placed it myself in the box and did all that what could come to my mind to avoid any replacement. Buying a own lock for this box and shut it off, took the box with me, put the key of the lock from this box into my car, locked the car, gave the key to somebody else, to Hans Scher, for example. And with all these things, I made sure that nobody would be able to open up the box except myself. The interesting thing is I had this box in my hand in such a way that the lock was covered within my palm. And I had it also surrounded with all the fingers. I had fingers on the top, on the side, and had the lock inside my hand. And I placed the box on the table, and I had it in my hands all the time. So nobody could have taken it or done something.
Walter Schnitger attended a Scole session on the 26th of July 1996. He held the box containing the film throughout, developing it himself. After developing the film, Walter Schnitger was shocked to discover a German poem, written in a style characteristic of the period around 1840. It was a poem of high quality, and despite extensive inquiries in Germany, its authorship remained unknown, without any record of publication.
Do you think there was any other way other than a paranormal explanation for this event to have occurred?
Yeah, whatever we call it, paranormal or what it is, there was something on the film that was obviously, when I bought the film, not on it. And I have no explanation how, with my understanding of techniques and physics and everything, how something like this could come to a film. So call it paranormal or whatever. Maybe we find a theory in 20 or in 100 years, and then we have a different name for this. But there's nothing available in my world of physics and techniques that could at all explain how that happened.
I wasn't myself present when a film with the German poem came up, but the person who was were two close cooperators of ours, Walter Schnitger and his wife. And Walter Schnitger, obviously German, he had the film in a box. The box was sealed, and he subsequently opened it, produced the film with the German message on. The German message was a poem that no one has yet been able to trace. We originally thought it was written by a man called Ruckert, who wrote in the 19th century. It was sort of written in the style of the 1840s, 1850s, Sturm und Drang sort of style, but the actual poem itself was handwritten in a style which was more typical of the way in which the Germans wrote German in the 1920s. So there was a puzzle there, but the film, the poem was regarded by Germans as being very good quality. And we made terrific efforts to find out whether it had ever been published, whether anyone would recognise it. We wrote to all the German professors in virtually all the universities in the country, and also went to Germany for this purpose as well, but no one was able to trace who wrote it or where it came from.
Authors of some of the films, like this German poem, proved impossible to trace. But others were easier to track down. This one contains a poem by Frederick Myers. Intriguingly, Myers was one of the founders of the SPR and a passionate researcher into the evidence for life after death. Before he died in 1901, he promised his colleagues at the SPR that he would try to communicate with them from the other side. Could this film actually represent evidence of the afterlife sent by one of its greatest investigators?
The Scole Group also believed that the late Thomas Edison communicated with them and placed the blueprint for a communication device on an unopened film. Edison created the blueprint for a trans-dimensional communicator to try and enable easier communication between the Scole Group and the Spirit team.
TDC is the actual small device that Spirit asked us to build. The plan for that was given to us on film by Edison himself.
The film that we saw had a little diagram on showing how the germanium gadget, as we called it, should be modified in such a way by the introduction of two coils and where the coils were to go, with a little description in writing as to why it was going to enhance reception.
These images appeared after an unexposed film locked in the security box was later processed by the scientists. The scientists speculated about who was providing this technical information. Then initials at the end of the film seemed to have solved this mystery.
I wrote to the Edison Memorial people in America, and they sent me a copy of one of his letters, which contained his initials, which looked almost identical to the signature on this film.
This matching set of initials convinced the researchers it was Thomas Edison providing this information. Not only was Edison the world's most famous inventor, he also had an enormous interest in the possibility of an afterlife. His intention to build a machine that could communicate with the dead made headlines around the world, but he died before being able to build it. Is it possible that through the Scole Group, he finally achieved this aim?
We built it just as he had put on the blueprint, and it took a long time to actually start to work. But once it did work, we had actual communication, vocal communication, with the spirit world and with other dimensions through this one little device. Really, it took about 18 months to get the results very, very good to top standard. But the very first person to talk to us through that TDC device was Edison himself.
The late Arthur Conan Doyle, former doctor and creator of Sherlock Holmes, was also said to participate in the Scole sessions. With the help of the Spirit team, he was able to transmit this photograph of himself onto a sealed Polaroid film in one of the Scole sessions. The former doctor became famous for his Sherlock Holmes creation, but he was known during his life to be fascinated with the idea of life after death.
One way that we also communicated with spirit, and which was a very effective way, was by use of an ordinary, very cheap tape recorder whose amplifiers were used by the spirit team to carry on a two-way conversation with us.
We inspected this machine and found it was completely normal. Earlier, its built-in microphone had been removed to eliminate the possibility of recording anything. When the machine, which contained a blank cassette, was activated, witnesses were astonished when they heard this voice asking them a question.
Scole Experimental Group.
Yes.
Yes, Scole Experimental Group. Experimenting with audio equipment.
Yes.
Historic moment it is.
I think the most memorable one, from my point of view, was where we had a tape recorder from which the microphone had been removed and in which we put in a blank tape. And apparently, as a present to me for my hard work, they said that they were going to bring something which was going to be, a music. And the music, I soon recognised, coming out of this machine, which was being held actually by my colleague David Fontana in his hand, having pressed the two buttons, record and play, which shouldn't have recorded anything at all, but it was recording Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, which had a lot of resonance for me. And there was a voice-over on top of it, which one could hear coming through. And this lasted for about 10 minutes or so and then faded out. There was a lot of white noise too, but it was a very good example of something which shouldn't have been there at all.
This particular experiment was perhaps the most important experiment of the whole series.
Visitors reported seeing these balls of light appear before them.
It's like fireworks.
On this occasion, one of them flew inside a large quartz crystal.
We could see it glowing and then descended into a Pyrex bowl. Then Arthur Ellison was invited to pick it up. He picked it up and satisfied himself that it was there and it was glowing, and he put it down again. He was asked right away to pick it up again. He tried to, and his fingers closed right over it. It had dematerialized.
There's nothing there, yes, it looks the same, but there's nothing there.
Then he was asked to pick it up again, and it rematerialized in his hand.
Oh, I can feel the crystal now.
Now this dumbfounded him. This is what finally convinced him that this was real, because it couldn't have been faked in any way. And he had his head right over the top of the bowl in order to ensure that no hand or no instrument could interfere with it.
Of course, we were totally amazed by this. Things do not materialise and dematerialise. This is against all the laws of nature. We're trained scientists, of course. We know how the world behaves, and it doesn't behave like that.
Well, you really think what we're experiencing now? Yes, it's amazing. Miracle, yes.
The spirit team told us that the experiment with the crystal in the bowl gave a good example of what happened when we die, in that the essence of the crystal remained even when the physical part of the crystal had been removed. Our bodies represent the physical part, but the essence of ourselves remains the same. This, if you like, can be termed the soul.
The Scole Group began a series of video experiments called Project Alice, after Alice through the looking glass. Their ambition was nothing less than to try and capture moving images sent from the spirit world. The Scole Group insists that instructions on how to position the camera and mirrors came from their spirit communicators. They were told to set up a video camera in the dark cellar, aim it at a pair of mirrors so that it could only film its own viewfinder. While it was recording, nothing unusual was seen. But when the tape was played back, these remarkable pictures appeared.
We had images on the video, sometimes of what looked like a tunnel of light. Other times spirit faces were coming towards us.
Word soon spread about the remarkable events occurring at Scole, and to help prove the phenomena was genuine, respected scientists were invited to attend. 3 members of the Society of Physical Research began sitting in the sessions. In the past, the SPR have exposed fraud and aren't easily deceived.
To preclude the possibility of fraud, these scientists were allowed to inspect the cellar and all its contents before and after sessions. All participants had to empty their pockets and leave their belongings outside. The cellar had only one entrance, and this door was kept locked during all sessions. Despite these precautions, the incredible events at Scole continued unabated, and the SPR investigators reported what they saw in graphic terms.
We saw coloured lights, we saw materialisations, we had direct voices, that is, spirit voices talking from the air.
In all honesty, I can say that all three of the guys that sat with us regularly over a 2-year period were sceptical. But had open minds. And when they wrote their book eventually about it, the Scole Report it was called, written by the SPR, it's one of their proceedings, they actually came out very, very much in favour of everything they'd witnessed being totally genuine.
The report into the activities of the Scole Group was the result of some 2 years' investigation that my colleagues and I did. I wrote the report, which runs to about 250, 300 pages, and it was published by the Society in conjunction with my two principal colleagues, that's Professor Fontana and the late Professor Ellison, and as I say, published in 1999.
I must stress, it changes your paradigm. You go in thinking none of this can be true, but after experience, after experience, after experience, it gradually dawns on you, hey, there's something going on here that we can't explain by normal scientific laws. Skeptics are often unaware of the amount of experience and the amount of knowledge that goes into investigations of this kind. Between the three investigators, you could say we'd had 50 years and more of experiences of this kind. We know all the tricks, and in fact we had a conjurer, a member of the Inner Magic Circle, as one of the people who sat with this group. James Webster, and his opinion, his professional opinion, was that there was no way in which any conjurer could have duplicated the phenomena that we saw there. In addition, of course, we were able to search the room thoroughly beforehand, search the room thoroughly afterwards, and so on. It's very important to have a magician at these investigations, because although scientists know the science and they know the tricks, they don't actually do the tricks themselves. You need a magician there who's done the tricks, who knows the circumstances under which he can get results, and the circumstances which would prevent him from getting results. Now, we were very fortunate. James Webster, who's a silver medal holder of the Inner Magic Circle, which is the main group of magicians in Britain, had sittings with the Scole Group, and in his professional opinion, there was no way in which any magician could duplicate the effects that he saw there, even if they were given access to the room beforehand and were able to bring in all their own equipment and so on.
The gyrations were sometimes so rapid that it almost left like a circle of light going over here and over there. Sometimes two lights would appear and just stare at me within inches of my eyes.
I thought at first that the lights must be small light-emitting diodes suspended on the end of nylon fishing line.
Then suddenly a light would start to do a tap dance on the table, bouncing up and down on the table, and you could hear it click as it rebounded from the table, and suddenly it
went pop, went through the table and came out the other side. Now, no nylon fishing line explanation would account for it going through an apparently solid, well, it was a solid object, a table.
Any one of those in the cellar, I'd say they were wasting their time doing this here for nothing, when they could be earning $1 million out there on the stage.
Spirit light generally take three forms. You have very small lights which dart around the room at great speed and cannot be duplicated by LEDs being swung round on long threads or anything of that nature, or carbon fibres or what have you. Then there are larger lights which do similar things but are the size of, let's say, marbles, quite large marbles. And then there are diffused patches of light which would be very, very difficult to explain by normal means. You can project a light onto a wall, but you can't project it readily in the air and float around and at our invitation come towards us or move away from us. And those diffuse patches of light would sometimes materialize into hooded forms, robed figures on the table in front of us a few inches away. We were even allowed to invite them to come very close to us, and then they would go up to the ceiling and then they would disappear. On other occasions, the diffuse patches of light would take the form just of a human face, moving round the room with the direct voice very, very faintly coming from the diffused patch of light, and the lips moving again very faintly. Again, these things are so extraordinary that when one tells them to people who've not had the experiences themselves, they think, oh, it must be trickery. And the challenge then always is, okay, you duplicate it. We threw out the challenge, we've maintained it throughout. We will give every assistance to any magician who wishes to come and duplicate those phenomena under those conditions, in the presence of investigators and in the presence of James Webster, who actually saw the genuine phenomena. The experiences that I've had have convinced me that it is very difficult to explain any of these things by an alternative explanation to that of survival.
Dr. Rupert Sheldrake is an internationally renowned biologist and author. He was also invited to sit in the Scole sessions.
Science has done very little to investigate the afterlife or reincarnation. Most materialists assume that both of them are impossible. So there's a kind of dogmatic denial by some scientists of the possibility of these things. But I wouldn't say that was a scientific understanding. I would say that was a dogmatic, ideologically motivated dismissal. The only way to have a scientific understanding is to do the research. Within science, based on a materialist point of view, the mind is the brain. So anything that suggests the mind might be more than the brain goes against the theory, and therefore most scientists don't want to know about it. The Scole experiments were done carefully, and they were done as properly as was possible under the circumstances. And all of us would have liked to have infrared sensitive cameras filming what was going on, and more light in the room. But this is something that, for various reasons, they wouldn't or couldn't agree to. Now, the cynics would say this is because they'd got something to hide. They would say this is because these phenomena can only manifest in darkness, and it wouldn't be possible to look at them under these conditions, and for some reason they didn't want it to be filmed with infrared cameras. It was just not something that the mediums or the spirits that spoke through them would agree to. So, unfortunately, the evidence isn't as conclusive as it would have been if phenomena had been captured on film and there'd been sufficient light in the room to rule out certain other explanations.
We persistently asked them to accept infrared cameras, and they said, not yet, we're not ready for it. It would interfere with the vibes, with the energy in some way. From our point of view, we could see no way in which this was likely or could be done. But then again, we don't understand how their method of communication or how their energy works. So we had to accept this with great reluctance.
When I attended a sitting in Scole with the Scole group, this was in a basement. It was dark. The mediums wore luminous bands around their wrists so that you could see where their arms were. But apart from that, there were no lights in the room, and so it was extremely dark. In the course of the session, there were things where lights appeared. At one stage there were small lights darting around the room. My mind was trying all the time to think of so-called rational explanations for this. So there were things there that I just couldn't understand in terms of any normal kind of explanation. This is where people who are experienced conjurers and illusionists come in, and they always say, oh, well, there's a way of doing it, we can trick people, and so on. The trouble is you get into this shadowy realm where you get claims from illusionists who claim to have a superior knowledge of all these tricks. I don't know of any that have duplicated that trick or shown how it could be done. I mean, it doesn't seem like a trick, but I mean, I couldn't stop all these skeptical thoughts flooding through my mind as I sat there seeing these things happen. At one stage, a disembodied hand appeared, and appeared to be floating over the table. I asked Mrs. Bradshaw, who was speaking through one of the mediums, if this was a disembodied hand. I said, I can see a disembodied hand. She said, it's not a disembodied hand. I said, you mean it's got an invisible body attached? And she said, precisely. And then she said, would you like it to touch you? And I said, yes. So she said, well, ask it. So I said, hand, will you touch me? And so the hand went round behind me and it tapped me on the shoulder. And then I saw it moving down and again floating over the table. Well, this again was extremely difficult to make any sense of. My mind went into overdrive thinking of explanations, you know, hands that were somehow with strings holding them up, and I mean, trying to think how this could be done through some kind of cheap conjuring trick. I couldn't think of any explanation of that kind. And so there were a number of strange physical movements and phenomena which were exceedingly hard to understand, which didn't make sense in any normal terms, which, if they were conjuring tricks, would have required extraordinary ingenuity. And I couldn't see any evidence that the people were moving around or doing this kind of thing, nor, since they seemed decent, honest, quite ordinary people, could I see why they'd want to get up to such elaborate tricks as these. So I was completely baffled by the entire experience.
The little light, which seemed to have a personality of its own, kept attacking me and rushed into my fingers at one point, and it felt as if it felt like, a little bit like a bee.
And then I thought, they've landed on me and I can feel them there. So what about if I close my hands like this and they just banged around inside my hand? I could feel that.
At one point I held both of my hands out and I asked with my mind for one of the lights to come towards me as if to test these mediums to see if this was for real. And one of the lights came flying over and touched the index finger of my right hand. So, and I could see, it was close enough that I could see that it wasn't attached to any kind of cord or fiber optic or anything like that. It was like solid light that like, boom, like touched my finger.
The lights appeared to be animated in the sense that they were intelligently directed and intelligently moving, and would be responsive to our wishes, whether expressed or silent. The lights would be mainly orbs that would move around with incredible speed, sometimes performing all sorts of gyrations in the air, but able to somehow or other be solid enough to make noises when they hit the top of the table, or you could feel them when they landed on our fingers. Well, the forms did vary. They were shadowy and they would float around. You could almost see through them. On occasions, a hand would materialize. I mean, I'm thinking of one occasion when a hand stroked my left hand. The hand was sufficiently visible in the light for me to see the fingernails. The hand was quite warm and natural. I wanted to ensure that, of course, it wasn't a hand that had been produced artificially or someone was stretching over the table. It was in such a position that it couldn't have been produced from any normal source. I was told who the hand belonged to, actually. It was a well-known dematerialized entity on the other side who appeared to be one of the spirits underlying the investigations and supporting it. I think it's pretty clear that there was a deliberate and a communal effort on the part of the spirit entities to prove survival and to cooperate in proving survival by a variety of different means and using their different specialities to do so. We were all pretty skeptical because what had been claimed seemed so way out. What had been claimed was primarily concerned with the production of pictures without cameras, without any form of manipulation by anyone. And this seemed to us to be worthy of investigation with a very critical hat on. As far as I know, the photographic material that was produced, strictly speaking, it's not photographic because no cameras were involved, but the films produced were unique. I don't know of any other experiment where this sort of thing has happened. There have been plenty of cases where photography has taken place, where someone's mind has been projected and you get a film, a single film. But strips of film made in these circumstances, in the sort of conditions that we had at Scole, no, there's been nothing quite like that. The assumption or theory is that these pictures were created by a thought process, but the mechanism of it being created on this film is totally unknown. The only alternative explanation is they are all fakes, and I don't believe that there's evidence that that is the case. I think that those pictures can be explained only by imagining that the spirits can project their recollections and images onto a film in some way we can't begin to understand. I can see no other explanation, and I don't understand what that explanation is, of course. If you take all the phenomena within the whole of the Scole experiment over 2 years while we were there, I would say that the possibility of fraud and faking was nil. But if you take each individual particular phenomena and examine the circumstances under which each phenomenon was produced, you could perhaps argue that there's a gap here, a hole here, something which wasn't absolutely 100%. But taking them all together, I think that there's no doubt that they were genuine. I think historically speaking, if you take the whole of the phenomena in the Scole group, it ranks among the most profound pieces of evidence for the existence of an afterlife. I don't know what happens when we die, but I'm quite convinced from all my experience, including the experience of the Scole experiment, that a consciousness survives, an intelligence survives in some form or other, and that what survives is mind and not anything else, but that mind can create its own environment, so that you do have people on the other side who can smoke cigars and listen to music and play games and walk through, because all of this is of their own creation. That's something which we find extremely difficult to envisage, but I'm quite sure that that's the sort of home that awaits us. The criticism that you don't get very much information which makes it clear what it's like to be in the afterlife is one that's always made, and I think it's always justified. The people on the other side say, look, we live in a totally different world in which we have none of the normal senses. We are just minds. And this is something, and also time doesn't mean anything. But you down here, you earthlings, can't understand this because you don't have the vocabulary, you don't have the conception to understand it, because your world is limited by your 3 dimensions. Now, I think that is probably true. It's very irritating, but it's probably true that we can't understand what it's like to be in a world without time, for example. So inevitably, the impression that we get are pretty vague and rather general as to what life is like there. But you see, we were not primarily concerned at that stage to deal with these so-called ontological problems about the nature of afterlife. We were primarily there to get valid information, valid phenomena, which was fraud-free. And then we were going to go on to the more important philosophical questions. We never got to that stage.
It was stopped for us, and we just simply lost connection with our spirit team.
Because unfortunately there were some complications with the whole setup, so that in the end there was a team in our future, an experimental team in our future, certainly not a bad team in any way, shape or form, and they were somehow connecting with us. They were using what was known, and we were told about it by the spirit people, a crystal probe, which unfortunately every time we sat they were able to connect into our work. Out of this came a most awful sort of hideous whining noise that stopped the mediums being in trance.
When Spirit had built the portal in which they could come through to us, they expected that the portal would extend beyond our lifeline so that we would be able to be in touch with people who at that time were probably living in the 2020s, our current time really. And what had happened was that they'd made the portal too large, and instead of having access from people who were living up to 2020, there were people in our future who were living up to 2100 who were trying to contact us every time we sat, and were using something called a crystal probe to work through our crystals to be able to contact us. And that had to be stopped because, as they explained, they had knowledge in 2100 which we didn't have. And if they had contacted us and had told us what was going on in 2100, and we had told the world about that, it could have changed the whole course of history. We were just not allowed to do that. So they had to close down what we had at Scole. Reluctantly, they did try and put it right, but in the end, they weren't able to do it, and consequently, they had to close us down.
But it was 5 wonderful years.
Whatever we're going to see and experience is something that we can't quite understand or accept now, and there's so many question marks about it that the easier thing to do is to say, well, I don't I don't want to be involved in it. Count me out. When I'm dead, I'm dead. Thank you very much. That's it. But I don't believe that to be true. I mean, I think that's just a way of running away from the facts. I don't particularly want to have anything other than pure death, and I would rather not believe in survival, but I find it impossible to be intellectually honest and not believe in survival.
Tragically, during the production of this film, Montague Keen died. But this gave us the opportunity of testing whether or not he actually got his wish for oblivion. This came in the form of Alison Dubois. Dubois has become one of the most famous mediums in the world after her abilities were dramatized in the hit TV show Medium. She was able to conduct her mediumship in full light, in front of the camera, with two researchers seated behind, asking questions.
Do you have any idea who this person is?
Dubois wasn't given any information about Keen. The only thing she was told was the first name of Keen's widow, Veronica.
He went down at a podium, or no. He's showing a man falling at the podium, like, and falls, and he goes down at the podium.
Okay.
This is important. It's like an assembly.
On the night of his death, Keen was taking part in a debate at the Royal Society of Arts in London. While defending his position, his voice faltered mid-sentence, and he died.
Many distinguished scientists spent many years studying.
Take a rest.
No, I don't even know what it means. I mean, he's making me feel like either he had a heart attack or his breath was taken from him, but he's showing him knees buckling and going down.
Is there a doctor in the house?
People jumping up, like everybody rising. He goes down and they go up.
Right.
Also, there would have been like a banner hanging of what this conference was or whatever it was. He's kind of laughing and he's like, way to go out, you know, like way to leave this world, you know, right there and then.
Dubois stated that Keen is now as interested in communicating with the living as he once was in talking to the dead.
We were told that the thing had been predestined before we were born, and that we had come back to agree to do this, the whole team, and that we'd been together before anyway. But we were told that this had been actually brought about by the spirit world before the last World War. So we had obviously agreed to come back and do something in this direction then. Basically, they wanted to prove to mankind that life existed after death, and that's what they were working towards. They wanted a situation where spirit personalities would actually materialize in front of large audiences in the light, and the proof would be there. You can hardly refute what you can see with your own eyes. The place of Scole was very important because it did actually lie on the main ley line that passed through the UK, which was known as the Michael and Mary ley line, coming from St Michael's Mount in Cornwall, and it went right through the country from southwest where St Michael's Mount is, right through to sort of East Anglia, passing right through Scole. And that's important because where there's a ley line, generally speaking, there's a lot of energy, spiritual energy. We don't actually have the phenomena that we had at Scole, but my wife and I do sit together from time to time.
But in fact, I'm sure that there are bigger things due. Once we're in place in this new foundation headquarters in Antikythera, there will be the most fantastic phenomena developed there that will beat anything that happened at Scole, but which will prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that life goes on after death.